Hello, everyone. Pastor George here with today's mailbag. And my mailbag question for today had to deal with Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, which you probably are all very familiar with, probably especially if you're a woman. So here's what it says. This is after the fall, and God is cursing humanity, right? He's cursing Adam and Eve. And so God says this to the woman. He says, this is from from the North American Standard Bible translation. He says, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. And so the question I had was, what does that last part have to do with, right? Yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you, right? The evidences of the first one are pretty straightforward, and how is that a curse? But especially, how do we understand that last part when it comes to relationships between men and women and husbands and wives, right? Because that's what this has to deal with. Well, this actually set me down a little rabbit hole, because my gut reaction to this, and this is funnily enough where I ended up, but I ended up finding a lot of different other ways of understanding this. But my gut reaction when I first read that, without doing a super in-depth study of it, was to just say, well, what it means is exactly what it says, right? The plain text meaning, in the sense that men will rule over women, and that is part of the curse, right? That's this idea that men are just going to take advantage of this system and make things difficult for women. And I think that that's partly true, although I do think it's colored a little bit by some of the language changes here. So there are basically 5 different ways that people have understood this. So one of them is that a woman will desire marriage and a husband and children despite the pain that will come from childbirth, right? I don't really think that that's there, but that's one of the reasons, right? A woman will desire marriage and sex despite the intimacy that's going to be ruined by the husband ruling over her, right? The other one is a wife's desires are submitted to her husband, so she has to pay attention to what he says, right? A wife will desire to control her husband is another way of understanding this, and a wife will have single-minded devotion for her husband. Now, I actually think all of these kind of fail in certain parts, right? And all of them come from different theological perspectives that are trying to make their own point. And I'll say that, I obviously come from my own, where I would say I reject a very strong complementarian view on this issue. Not that I'm not a partial or understanding of that. I think there's some merits to it, certainly, but I don't think, I think you have to do some little bad exegetical work to make it say desire, that she wants to control her husband, or that that she has to submit her desires to her husband, right? I don't think that that's exactly what the text is saying, and I think this comes out more clearly in the Hebrew. So the Hebrew word for desire there is teshukah, right? So teshukah is the Hebrew word there, and I actually found it more helpful because there's, of course, different things, right? There's desire, there's turning, there's something like that. But interestingly enough, when I went to do a little bit more digging, I went into the Greek, and one of the easiest things to do is just to say, okay, well, how did other ancient people translate this type of thing, right? If we can't find a reasonable way in the Bible to figure this out, well, we can go to the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament done by rabbis in the BC times. So I looked at that, and funnily enough, I didn't know this really, but the word that's used there is apostrophe, which is apostrophe. That's where we get that name for our grammatical symbol there, right? Our punctuation mark. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. And so, again, it means turning, but it has this more, I would say, strongly of turning away from something that's better and towards something else, right? So instead of turning to God, for instance, women turn towards their husbands, and it has this idea that if that's the case, then they desire men in the sense of husbands or that relationship as an idol above and beyond God, right? And I actually think that ends up leading to a lot of the problems in society and things like that. And I think that that's pretty interesting because, of course, then God has the other part, which is that men will rule over them, right? And that's not always been done in a good way. And so I think that that's kind of the challenge. And so part of it, right, part of these like really strong certain branches of like patriarchal movement are definitely sin. And I think that's what the marks of it is coming from Genesis. I'm not saying in general complementarianism is sinful or anything like that. I think that'd be a way of an overstatement. But I think that like the inherent thing that this is clearly getting at, that's a part of the female experience, like birth, is just being subject to men throughout history, right? In the same way that like men have their own problems that are clear in God's pronouncement over them for sin, right? So I just think it's part of the thing that's interesting here is that this is something that's repaired when Jesus comes in the New Testament, right? Because one, Christianity brings with it huge changes to the way that women and men are viewed, especially like within that culture at the time, but even now in some pretty radical ways. And I think that really shows that there's been a new age that has kind of been ushered in, that the church is supposed to lead the way and like what healthy relationships between men and women look like. And this idea of the power imbalance is to be kind of jettisoned in a broader societal sense, I think is the best way to put it, rather than having just a patriarchal government or something like that. Rather than that, it's much more nuanced now. So a lot more you can say on that, but I just like went on a huge rabbit hole down there, and I wasn't able to get all my thoughts out because these videos are supposed to be shorter. But anyway, that's what I found, and so it was kind of interesting. Probably more to say on that, but I don't have the time. So I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and I will see you on Sunday for worship. Peace out.